Hi, I'm Jonathan Treussard, and welcome to Treussard Talks, where we talk about the mechanics of investing, the psychology of investing, and what it means to manage your wealth with purpose. Because understanding your wealth shouldn't be as complex as building it. Welcome to today's show. Brent Sullivan, thank you for being on Treussard Talks today.
Oh, happy to be here, Jonathan.
This is great. So let me give a quick intro, and then I'm going to give you the floor. You were on the trading floor for a period of time at PIMCO, a local firm that manages about $2 trillion. People might have heard about it. I would love to hear some stories of your time on the trading floor at PIMCO. You then went on to Parametric Advisors in Seattle, which is a $600 billion shop that really specializes in quantitative, tax-aware strategies. And at some point along the way, you decided to become the Tax Alpha Insider. So I want to hear a little bit about your life story, and then let's dig into what it means to be the Tax Alpha Insider, starting with actually defining the meaning of those words, particularly Tax Alpha. But tell me how this all began.
Well, so my background is really half quantitative, half investing. And so, I started out, actually my second job out of graduate school was on PIMCO's trading floor. And I was essentially a grunt for one of the now CIOs. And that was tremendous experience working at scale. Everything there is just massive. And also we had a very, very tiny tax practice for institutions, banks, and insurance. And so that's where I first got exposed to like capital gains management in the very simplest way. And then later on, I moved up to Seattle to be with my girlfriend, now wife, and she's a very, very long-term Amazonian, at least as of this recording. And she convinced me to move up to Seattle. I worked on another trading floor. I was a credit analyst, and then everybody around me was writing code, so I started writing code. So Parametric Portfolio Associates up here in Seattle was my first coding job. So I did that for a handful of years. I've been doing independent consulting, and my blog is Tax Alpha Insider. I'm just a completely independent tax analyst.
The combination of being truly quantitative and understanding coding and having a clear sense of what the investment world is about is super valuable. So let's talk about your blog and the meaning of Tax Alpha Insider. And then we can get into some of the topics du jour, where a lot of action is taking place and a lot of talk certainly is taking place. So how do you define Tax Alpha?
Well, so I think about Tax Alpha as anything that a product or an investment manager or an investor can do to either outright mitigate taxation of their portfolio or to defer it into the future, to defer tax liability into the future. So at the product level, we might be talking about like the difference between a mutual fund, a cash in, cash out vehicle versus an ETF. And I'm talking about US equities generally. And the ETF tends to be more tax efficient just because it has access to a whole trading, essentially layer between it and investors via the authorized participant business. So ETFs tend to be more efficient. The choice between mutual fund and ETF could represent a certain form of tax alpha. You're getting the benefit of deferral there. Other things, where you put the assets in your portfolio, put the bonds in the tax advantage or tax exempt accounts, put the high growth stuff in a brokerage account, realize those gains when you're in a low bracket, could be in retirement, could be soon. Those are all sort of tax alpha-ish decisions. It's tax-aware investing manifest, and tax alpha is just a way to try to quantify all that effort into at least something that you can say like, oh, this was worthwhile.
Right. And obviously the conversation, look, I think tax alpha is important for everybody, but the conversation really gets hyper-focused when it comes to people in high tax brackets, people that have high asset bases and high income. And so, unfortunately, my concern with that conversation is all of a sudden you're selling a thing, you're selling this benefit without really an understanding of the mechanics of it. And honestly, the fact that both for very clear reasons having to do with the tax code, but also because we live in the real world, you can't put the tax considerations first. They have to live in the bigger context of, hey, what's the strategy actually doing from an economic standpoint, from an investment standpoint? And so I want to ground people in that construct, which is as exciting as it is to talk about mitigating and deferring taxes, that really ought to be node 2 or like node 200 in the conversation, even though it's very important. So let's start at the top. You just mentioned ETFs. I want you to dig in a little bit more because, again, I don't think it's magic, it's mechanics. So let's talk a little bit more about why ETFs have the potential of being more tax friendly, number one, and then some of the innovations around seeding in kind as opposed to with cash, all of that stuff.
Well, I mean, just to take it from the top, I think you're exactly right. So if I think about diligence of a new investment product or of an investment manager, I always take it like, we're talking about risk reward probably as the first layer of diligence, then categorization and inflation protection and diversification, things like that. Like all of the risk reward stuff that, is involved in constructing a diversified, resilient portfolio that's going to last hopefully for decades. All that stuff comes first. And then next, I start thinking about cost. And one component of cost is taxation. And so you'll notice, it took me a while to get down to where's tax in my whole diligence process? It's not a first order thing. And so I always try to tell people, the adage is don't let the tax tail wag the investment dog. And that's because you should be doing all that other work first before you get down to tax world. My analysis tends to be pretty one-dimensional. I consider risk and reward and things like that. But when you get down to where I spend my day, I'm really talking about mechanics. Like, how does this thing work? What is the character of a distribution that might be coming off of a vehicle? When do you receive it? What's the magnitude? Is it foreign? Is it domestic? Whatever. All that stuff, that's so far from the risk-reward decision that you should have already made by the time you're getting down to cost world. And again, tax is a component of cost. And so that's how I think about it. I sort of know my order. I know where I sit in the diligence stack. That doesn't make the work any less exciting. This stuff is incredibly opaque and complex at times. And I think that it just needs to be considered as an overall component of cost. So with all that said, we could talk about ETFs and what's special about ETFs. So ETFs have what's called in-kind creation and redemption. And a taxable event happens whenever an ETF essentially closes a position. I say close, not sell, because you could have short positions, and closing a short is not a sell, it's a buy. So the important thing here is that you have taxable events, and ETFs do a good job of minimizing disfavorable taxable events. So an ETF, a lot of people don't know this, an ETF will tax loss harvest internally. What that means is if they have a losing position, they'll sell it, they'll rebuy something economically similar, and they'll bank that asset on the internal balance sheet for use in the future. That's a tax asset that will defray tax later. So that's an internal operation. That's tax loss harvesting, ETF portfolio internally. Okay, but whatever. Mutual funds do that too. It depends on a bunch of different risk considerations. But the extra special thing about the ETF wrapper is that in-kind redemption process. That's where an ETF can take low cost basis positions. Those are the positions most likely to realize a taxable event. It will take those low cost basis positions and it will essentially redeem them in kind. That's not a taxable event. And the receiver of that redemption also does not experience a taxable event. That's an institutional broker dealer that has the moniker authorized participant in this context. But the important thing is that the portfolio is able to rebalance internally without realizing taxable events. It's a very unique feature of the ETF wrapper. And, big caveat here, it doesn't apply to everything. So we're usually talking about US equities. There are exceptions in international equities, has to do with where those issues are traded. There's an exception for bonds. This tends not to be the case. You tend to not see so much tax efficiency in bond ETFs because they don't really generate capital gains, but they do, especially in high yield land. And when they do, they also don't take full advantage of the in-kind redemption mechanism that typically US equities take full command of. So there's a lot of different carve-outs here. The important thing to know is that ETFs are efficient, tax efficient, and the reason is usually in-kind redemption.
So let me try to rephrase it in simple terms, right? Which is, hey, an investment vehicle, a mutual fund, an ETF really is a box. And when taxable events happen inside the box, then congratulations, investor, you own the taxable event, right? But when you have this ability to hand off what would be otherwise a very likely candidate for a taxable event to an outside participant through this weird, arcane, mechanical thing called a creation and redemption process, then you've basically moved the taxable event outside of the box. You kind of make it go poof, while retaining the ability to do what you need to do from an investment standpoint. Is that kind of the punchline?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the trade-off there is you're introducing deviation when you harvest a loss in that manner. And that just means that the ETF might not track its exact mandate or its underlying benchmark with 100% fidelity. If I was going to put like one finer touch on this, it would be you tend to see less tax loss harvesting, less deviation type behavior in index ETFs because they're tracking error mandate. In other words, they have very little flexibility to deviate from the benchmark. But if we move away from index ETFs, then we start to see more tax efficiency emerge because the investment manager does not have to adhere strictly to the exact replication of the underlying index. So again, these are all just different things that you have to check off when you're looking at a new product. But yeah, the ETF wrapper has some special magic behind it.
Thanks for listening. I'm Jonathan Treussard, founder of Treussard Capital Management. If you'd like to start receiving my free newsletter, Wealth Empowered, or if you'd like to learn more about me and Treussard Capital Management, go to Treussard.com. That's TREUSSARD.com. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode. You've introduced the concept of in-kind redemption as a mechanical device for the manager of the ETF, but now the concept of in-kind contribution has become more basically investor-facing.
So over the past, definitely over the past 2 years, but this has certainly been happening longer, a lot of ETFs have come to market with a rider. And the rider says, if you would like to seed this ETF in kind, like using your existing portfolio, it could be individual stocks, it could be a portfolio of ETFs, just depends on your circumstances. But these ETFs will accept assets in kind. And what that means is that investors no longer have to sell their existing assets, realize a bunch of tax, and then take those proceeds and invest in a new ETF. They can just go straight from A to B without any tax in between. That's very compelling. It's a very popular strategy in niche communities. It's gaining popularity. Its technical name is Section 351 conversion. And originally it was used to fund new companies. And you can think of an ETF as just a new company. And the viso that I would add is that it's only possible at launch. So you're bootstrapping a new company. The new company only has one launch. That's when you have to seed it. But let me pause there. I can think of use cases, but does the concept and sort of the intent make sense?
The way I would reword it and tell me where I get it wrong is imagine that your current, because again, we start from an investment premise standpoint. Congratulations, you've done very well in a very concentrated way. Maybe you had shares granted to you through employment. Maybe you happened to buy the S&P at an all-time low. And all of a sudden you wake up years down the line with highly concentrated exposures to a current employer, a former employer, or just a specific part of the market. Call it US stocks. And at that point you say, it just feels a little spicy. It feels a little concentrated. And historically, one of the impediments to addressing the issue was, you know what else is spicy is the tax bill on your path to a better diversified positioning. And what you're saying is, well, actually now there's a pathway, which is not a straight pathway and has all sorts of limitations. But there's a pathway by which you could actually drive towards the investment outcome you want to drive towards, which would be something like a better diversified portfolio, better balanced portfolio, without going through the realize capital gains, pay a big tax bill kind of pit stop. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I always say you can go from A, which is your existing allocation, to B, which is a desired allocation. It's a brand new ETF that you're interested in. You can go from A to B in a very smooth, frictionless way. That's pretty compelling. And I'd say like one of the more interesting cases is certainly when you have a concentrated position and there are certain rules you have to follow if you want to go from A, your existing allocation, to B, this new ETF. And one of the rules that you have to follow is this diversification provision in Section 351. And it says two important things. One, that only 25% of the seed portfolio can be a single name. And two, the top 5 names that you contribute have to be less than 50%. So those are the 25 and 50 tests. And as long as you check those diversification boxes, there are other boxes, but those are the big ones for like risk reward. As long as you check those boxes, you can go from A to B in a tax frictionless way. There are other catches, and if you're considering one of these, talk to the sponsor and 351 counsel about how exactly they're going to affect this conversion. But in general, the 25-50 diversification rules are the ones that you have to keep in mind if you're trying to take advantage of Section 351.
So it can help, but it's not a magic bullet. If 100% of your taxable wealth is in a single stock, bad news. This is not magic. This is mechanics and a thoughtful application, a thoughtful understanding of the tax code, so on and so forth. I want to go back to something you've said before. And here is particularly, I think, compelling for people because you described it as kind of seeding a new company. When you're investing, whether it's through a fund or in a fund, there's a matter of professional competence. You're trusting a certain party to actually execute in a highly competent way. When it's a US equity ETF, that's kind of straightforward. Now we're talking about 351 in-kind seeding. Hey, that's probably the next level of competence where you're going to want to make sure that you're handing your assets to a party that really knows what they're doing. And then there is the next thing that people in my line of work are hearing a lot about is this concept of tax-aware long-short hedge funds and tax-aware long-short separate accounts. And this is where, again, for me, understanding the mechanics is really important. Understanding how things can go badly is incredibly important because the claims can just be too compelling to stop you in your tracks when it comes to doing your due diligence. So you want to take us to the land of, I guess they call it tax aware, right? They don't call it tax efficient, tax aware hedge funds and separate accounts.
Sure, yeah. So this research actually goes back to the 80s, or at least the early 80s. I can think of a paper right now. And it talks about how you can have a long position and a short position. And that means that in effect, you could be tax loss harvesting when the market goes up, and you could be tax loss harvesting when the market goes down. This research is old, but I would say it's been productized for a wide audience. It's tens of thousands of accounts now, such that it's easier to buy. It's no longer a bespoke solution. All these solutions are bespoke. They're, the first iteration is funds, but they also come in separately managed accounts. So yes, they're bespoke, but it's not kind of one-off stuff anymore. These things are full-on productized. And what that means is that we're starting to get, one, really high-quality research on the behavior of these products over time. And two, we're also starting to get anecdotal experiences from how advisors and investors are actually using these products. Like, it's great. In theory, I've got this paper. It says I'm going to realize a ton of capital losses, and that's essentially going to act as a grease that I just have on my investment mechanism, and everything's super efficient now because I've got this store of capital losses. That, in some cases, turns out to be mostly true, but again, we're talking about taxes now. We're deep in the diligence stack, and the first couple layers you have to get through first. And the first one is, of course, like risk reward. What does this, does this long, short, whether it's an overlay or if it's just an outright new portfolio exposure, does it make sense from a risk and reward perspective first? And then finally, how much does it cost? And there are incremental costs with long and short. There's financing, there's trading, there's the investment management fee itself. So once you've finally gotten down into that layer, now we can talk about tax. And yes, there are substantial tax advantages, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I've given you all the headlines, and now you kind of probably want to know, like, what is this thing? Like, how does it work? So let me give you just a couple sentences on that. And the way that it works is, imagine that you have a portfolio. Let's start with cash. You contribute $100 cash into a separate account. You can think of this analogously as like a brokerage account. The manager is going to take those $100, use them as collateral for a margin loan, and they're going to add a certain amount depending on the leverage that you've selected. Let's say it's $50 in margin loan. So you contributed $100, you added 50 more in margin. At the same time, they're going to introduce $50 of short positions. So you have $100 of collateral that you've contributed, a $50 margin loan, and $50 of shorts. That portfolio, the nomenclature now is to call that a 150-50. It's 150 on the long, 50 on the short. And the idea is that those extensions, the 50 margin and the 50 short positions, net with each other in a markety kind of way. You're hoping to generate alpha between those two. It's a market neutral extension. But in general, the overall exposure, the 150-50, is attempting mostly to be beta 1. So if you have S&P 500 exposure, and that's beta 1 in this case, then the extensions hope to keep you also at beta 1, but to again squeeze relative value between the margin and the shorts, and then also to be harvesting losses in up and down markets using those extensions. There's a lot to monitor. There's a lot more going on there, but that's the gist on the separate account side. The trader funds are different, but let me pause. That's already a ton of content.
Yeah, what you just said is very important, particularly when it comes to the trader funds. But when people start saying things like, well, this could actually offset W-2 income and regular income, ordinary income, people get very excited. And you do the call with the investment manager, the firm that's actually running these things, and then they show you the year-to-year volatility of the thing, and it has volatility like any other investment product. Maybe it's 20% or something. And all of a sudden, people stop paying attention because they realize this is really an investment product that happens to have this particular tax byproduct is a decent way to describe it. But that's, to me, the thing that people have to understand about these things. They're not tax incineration machines. They're investment vehicles with tax implications. And the other piece of it, and I know this because of my experience in long short world and market neutral strategies and all of that, is all of that works well until, and then you got to figure out where the until is. If you're running this thing and you're running this as a margin account effectively, well, there's a thing called the borrow rate. And if your counterparty gets to decide when they jack up your borrow rate by a huge amount over the course of like a weekend, that's not a good situation. Or maybe, the market gets so dislocated that a regulator says, hey, maybe we're not going to do this short thing for a period of time. Well, that can get pretty exciting too. So yeah, take me to that for a second.
No, those things are exactly right. So I think there's two separate instances here. So we've got the separate accounts. The separate accounts will generate capital gains and losses. And then we have the trader funds. And just so folks know, a trader fund is a hedge fund, but it's got some extra boxes checked. And those are two separate things, but let's start with the separate accounts because they're interesting. So what investors need to consider is like just what you said, Jonathan, like what can go wrong here. And there's a couple different things. So one, again, you've got this margin loan, you've got the shorts. I mean, there's just a chance that you just underperform. Like you get the relative value play between those two things just wrong. Okay, well, if that's wrong, that's negative alpha. That's drag on the core portfolio. We haven't even talked about tax or any of that stuff yet. We're talking about raw total return underperformance. Okay, that's a bummer. This is a very much an active strategy. You have folks who are picking longs and they're picking shorts. We haven't talked about mechanics or anything like that yet or black swan events. We're talking about stock picking ability as a first order concern for investors interested in these strategies. So you have to buy that like as a first order thing. Do you trust the manager who is running this thing to actually generate alpha? Because again, this is an active strategy. Let's say that you do. Let's say that you believe that. Now we can start talking about like more complex stuff that can happen. When we start to get into black swan territory, there are a couple different things that can happen. So first of all, you've pledged collateral. Like that collateral is essentially like your buffer against really bad stuff happening. And one case is margin calls. Margin calls tend to be sort of rare in long short. The reason is that the short and the long, in fact, is a hedge against each other. So let's say margin calls can happen, and that can be an unfortunate thing from a tax timing perspective. But let's say that even that's like sort of rare in long short world. So yes, the investor is almost bilaterally exposed to the custodian in an adverse circumstance. I don't want to say this is catastrophic risk, but hypothetically, maybe I have one or two anecdotes of this stuff, but it's pretty rare. But let's say that like you have an investor, they're invested in a long short strategy. The long short strategy, you are paying for margin, and you are also getting rebated for the collateral on the short positions. So the margin rate and the short rebate, those are financing rates that are just like completely dependent on whatever the custodian/broker is granting them to you. So remember, in a black swan situation, like those entities' instinct is self-preservation. So that's interesting because like under those circumstances, they could, in theory, I'm not saying this would happen. I'm not even saying it's easy to find examples of this. But what could happen is that they could jack up your margin rate. They could say, nope, we need more compensation, or you're going to pay us more for access to our balance sheet. They could cut the short rebate rate. They could say, we're going to pay you less for essentially earning return on our platform. So they could certainly do that. I'd say the more common situation, the one that I actually do have anecdotes of, is that the haircut that they apply to collateral assets. So that's the core portfolio that investors have contributed. They can increase the haircut. And that one I think is like, it's much easier for them to do administratively. And I do have like specific examples of very large brokers doing that when a name gets like very volatile. Tesla is a classic example of a haircut introduced, much larger haircut once Tesla got to a certain level or it experienced a certain amount of volatility. Okay, so we're so far down in the weeds right now, but if investors are just like kind of trying to wrap their minds around what's happening here, just remember that they do have exposure to the lender and their instinct for self-preservation in a black swan scenario.
This is really important stuff, right? You contribute cash, and all of a sudden, then you say, cool, let's go buy a bunch of stocks, more than the cash. And now you have a long asset, right? And they say, okay, so we lent you money, and there is a going rate for doing that. That's number one. The other part of it is you're probably going to be shorting stuff. So there is a thing called the borrow rate, right? The market says, hey, you want to short things? That basically means you're borrowing these shares from somebody else. And as with all forms of loans, there is a rate associated with borrowing these things. That can bounce around, right? So you can get into a situation where everybody says, yeah, no problem. You can keep executing on your strategy. It just happens to be that the prices have changed. The interest rate on the loan has gone up. The interest rate on the borrowed shares has gone up. Oh, and by the way, the long thing that you held that was kind of collateral against this whole thing, we used to give you 90% credit for it, but today I feel like it's going to be 70%. That's the reality, which is when things kind of get ugly, you call it self-preservation, and they're just trying to get through the day. They're trying to make sure that their entity is still alive and well in the morning, to the extent that this really cuts through all of the layers of complication, and it's about the balance sheet of a financial institution. That becomes job number one. They don't really care if you're a customer tomorrow. They just really care that they be in business tomorrow.
But yeah, if things get really, really dark, then yeah, their instinct is self-preservation. But I want to hedge this. It's like, okay, you're aware of these black swan risks, and these are black swan events. This is not routine operations. If we've entered that world, just like a question I'm like struggling with myself is like, is that exclusionary? I had an advisor say to me the other day, he's like, look, you're 5 layers deep in like black swan world, but like you could jump in the ocean and get bit by a shark, but does that mean you don't swim? And I was like, I mean, that's fair. But I mean, I think what we need to do, or we need to have like eyes wide open on strategies like this, where we're sort of dependent, again, on the balance sheet of a financial institution whose ultimate goal is self-preservation. And so what does that mean? Like concretely, I'm hesitating, I'm a little bit, but what that means generally in general risk management practices, and Jonathan, you probably know more about this than I do, but what it generally means is that you do not put your entire portfolio in that one strategy. Because what that means is when things, again, get really dark, that you are solely exposed to a whole slew of risks that we don't consider on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, that's interesting. It just means that if somebody says this is, long short is a great strategy, it means that maybe it's 20% of your Or maybe it's like half of your US core equity exposure. The other half is something really simple and easy to understand and not bilaterally exposed to a lender. And maybe that's what the risk mitigation practice is. We don't know. I don't think there's any research that's actually like caught up to this. And we are definitely in the weeds, but it's something I think about. I think about diversification, not just of the risk reward profile of an overall portfolio, but also about all of the downstream impacts, like second order effects, black swan type stuff. That's super interesting to me. And how do we build resilience into portfolios that is not, things are not just going to get really terrible when you need it most. One other thing I'd say here is like, the institutions that are granting margin and shorts or managing lending books, Fidelity, Schwab, Interactive Brokers, there's others, Pershing. I mean, I would say that like if there are dislocations and really odd treatment where they're curling into the fetal position, they're very terrified about financial circumstances. My instinct is that would be short-lived. It would revert. So again, if you were going to take that kind of exposure, there could be some temporary pain. So just make sure that you are prepared for temporary pain. But I guess the operative word there is temporary. Like, is this market going to go away? No, I don't think so. You just have to be prepared. If I'm putting on my risk management hat and I want portfolio preservation in the darkest times, there are incremental risks here beyond just a long-only portfolio.
Yeah. And I think that's what you have to do, right? Is get past the idea that this is a free lunch, right? This is not a free lunch. This is careful work that needs to be done. And there are corner cases. And thinking through the dark cases is not dangerous, right? The dangerous thing to do is to go all in without recognizing what you're taking on. That's it. And then you can make an adult decision about, how much is too much and still decide that it's, worth doing some amount, et cetera, et cetera. Look, I love all of this. This is fabulous. One last bit I want to touch on the way out before we close with some fun personal questions is the last thing that I think is capturing a lot of attention. I mean, infinite topics, but the last thing that's really capturing a lot of bandwidth these days is the concept of box spreads. Some of it has been institutionalized in products, and some of it has become another thing that people talk about as financial engineering for the masses. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. So kind of take me to box spread, trading land.
Well, yeah, sure. So a box spread is a four-legged options trade, but set that aside now, like that's complex baloney. I think the easiest way to understand a box spread is really a zero coupon bond. So when the government issues a zero coupon bond, they are borrowing. And somebody buys the zero coupon bond, they are lending. And if we can just use that analogy, just think about a zero coupon bond whenever you think about a box spread. There are two sides to this market. Again, just like a zero coupon bond, there's a borrower and there's a lender. And so what we're seeing now is products that take advantage of both sides of that trade. On the borrowing side, imagine, Jonathan, that you need to take out a new construction loan because you are renovating your kitchen. Okay, well, there's a couple different ways to do that. You could use a credit card, but let's say you're not going to do that. Let's say that you're going to borrow against your portfolio of assets. You're going to take out a margin loan. You're going to deploy the margin as a construction project. Okay, that's one way you could do it. One alternative to that is to use a box spread. And what that means is you execute these four options positions, and those four options positions result in a net credit to your account. You can withdraw the net credit. You can deploy it as you see fit. There's risk associated with that. Your collateral quality comes to mind. You could get margin called. It's relatively uncommon, but it could happen. And so you've got this loan now that you can deploy. The reason is that you're able to typically get unencumbered risk-free interest rates, concrete-ish numbers. If your margin account would let you borrow, let's use a slightly egregious example. Let's say it's 10% to borrow against your assets. Now, box spread comes directly from the marketplace. There is no intermediary in the version that you execute yourself. This comes directly from the marketplace. You literally execute four options at the exact same time. Your portfolio gets a credit. It comes straight from the market. I think about it like a tap that you turn on. The liquidity just comes out if you have the collateral sitting there and you're approved for options. The difference between, let's say, the 10% that the margin account might charge you and the box spread rate is the box spread rate is going to be like way closer to the treasury rate, plus a little spread. And that little spread might get you down to half the margin rate. So 10% on the margin side, maybe 5-ish% on the box spread rate. And again, that'll trade above treasuries. Everybody always thinks it's because of credit risk. It's not. Box spreads are centrally cleared. The OCC is a systemically important financial institution. Its trades are guaranteed, and any collateral default at the OCC is also guaranteed by OCC members. Suffice to say, it's not credit risk typically. It's actually just the fact that treasuries trade at a premium because they have moneyness. They can be pledged as collateral. You can't do that with a box spread. Okay, so that's a long explanation to say you're going to get treasuries plus a little bit with the box rate. And so on the borrowing side, you can get a much better rate on the loan. You also get capital gains treatment on the implied interest expense on the loan.
Yeah.
Borrowing, let me pause there. That's a ton.
Before we move to because again, people will hear this and they'll say, that's amazing. I get to borrow at half the rate of my margin account and I get to do it myself and interact with the market. That sounds magical. One of the things that is very important is, do you understand how options work? And by the way, do you understand the distinction between an American option and a European option? Because in particular, if you don't, this is like the old, don't try this at home kind of proposition. So the idea is you've created a quote unquote, and we're going to put many quotes on this, quote unquote, risk-free position by doing this four-legged option trade. Guess what? If you have a weird contract in the mix that doesn't match the other ones in terms of when that leg goes away, there's nothing risk-free about it.
Yeah, I'm smiling because it could go sideways really fast. If you don't know what you're doing, there's like a whole checklist that you have to go through. Let's say that you've already made it through that checklist. All of the options are going to be executed with European expiration. You've chosen the strikes and the expiration such that they meet your financial circumstances. Your collateral is also high quality and unlikely to get haircut further if circumstances materially degrade. Those are all the things that I'm thinking about. There's still more. But let's say that you've gotten to that point and you're just like, yes, I've checked all these boxes. And then you go to execute and you don't know how to execute because you're not a trader. You push all the buttons and you're like, oh, whatever, that looks like a good rate, and wrong. Maybe you have no idea what the rate should be on a box spread. You don't know what bid ask is on a set of 4 options executed simultaneously. Come on. Most people don't have an instinct for these things. These are learned skills. And so I'm not lobbying for anybody in this industry. I won't give you any names, but there are several providers who will do this for you, who have decades of experience executing box spreads. They'll manage your collateral, they won't manage it, but they'll keep a very close eye on your collateral. They'll execute it with all these boxes checked ahead of time. You have to consider, if you're going to take one of these loans out using a box spread, is it worth working with a pro who just knows what they're doing? That's what I'm thinking. How do we just tighten down all the risks on here? And one way is just to outsource the risk entirely. You of course pay a fee for that, but it's just one thing worth considering.
So now let's go to the other side. What if you're actually lending?
Okay, so if you're lending via box spread, the latest innovation is to do this via the ETF wrapper. There are many ETFs that will allow you to essentially lend at the box rate. There's tax advantages to this. There's a little bit of outperformance you can get as a sort of first order concern. But the way that works is that you essentially just go buy the ETF, the market sees the cash come in, and then the authorized participants will do a cash create for a product like that. It's actually tends to be simpler. In theory, it's simpler from an operational standpoint than a cash or an in-kind create used for an index ETF or something like that. So this is a cash create. Your cash goes into the marketplace and then it gets contributed directly to the ETF, not from you, but from the authorized participant who's trying to arbitrage the difference. The manager of their portfolio will go request a new box spread using those proceeds. And then what they've done at that point is they've lent and they are lending, and you are just participating in the lending that's happening through that fund. So if you think about it, you've got borrowers. Again, there's Jonathan, who's going to take out the construction loan to refurbish your kitchen. Okay, that's a borrower. Where does the cash come from? One of the sources is box spread ETS. It's literal, there are these options.
It's the creation of a market.
Yeah, there is actually a counterpart on the other end of options trades. It's not the same as just a pure secondary market with equities. Like options are much more bilateral. They're centrally cleared. Don't get me wrong. You're not attached to a human being on the other side of it, but the cash does come from somewhere. So if you're borrowing, the cash has to come from somewhere. It could come from the market, could come from a box ETF.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot, which I'm incredibly grateful for. Now, I will say that none of this is financial advice. We're just educating, and particularly, I think, given the tenor of our conversation, we're really educating about what could go wrong in a lot of cases. So that's really important. And it doesn't mean that things are bad or good in absolute terms. It just means that if you don't understand something, you may want to kind of pause before you engage. This is what I love about the specialization of your knowledge base is we can actually have an in-depth conversation where you walk away better understanding the mechanics, better understanding where things could go badly, and make educated decisions on the benefits relative to the potential risks. So thank you for that. Now, before we roll out, I ask my guests a series of questions at the end of every episode. And it's a series of questions I inherited from my youth watching French TV when I was a kid in Paris. So are you ready for a quick, rapid fire set of questions?
Of course, yeah.
All right. Well, interpret them as you see fit, okay? What is your favorite word?
You know, the first one that came to mind was conjecture. I don't know why, but I sort of like the, what's it called when you make the sounds in your mouth? You know, it almost feels very German to me. It's got a lot of consonants. And so I like the way it sounds, but I also like what it represents. It suggests some humility. Like I don't actually know what the answer is, but I'm going to make an educated guess. And so I like it on a couple different dimensions.
What is your least favorite word?
That's a good one. Sorry, I'm going to pause here awkwardly. I actually want to think about it. I don't know. Do I have a least favorite word? You know, this is okay. So let's talk French for just a minute. Jonathan, if I say the word rapprochement, what does that mean to you?
It means getting closer together in a kind of odd bedfellow kind of way.
So exactly. And I always like this word always kind of like, it has like a kind of a happy vibe to it, but I think it's like, it's too loaded. Like it requires unpacking.
It has darkness.
Yeah. And aside from just the mechanics of actually saying it, like I don't speak French. And so it's actually quite demanding for me to say it with a straight face. Hegemony comes to mind too in that context. And so, yeah, there's a darkness to it, maybe that I just don't, it makes my tummy feel weird. I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good one to question. One is, you know, why over intellectualize it? I have opinions about people who use words like utilize instead of use. Importantly, I think rapprochement, again, has an historic load to it, which doesn't feel great. It feels like a short-term fix to a long-term problem.
And that's exactly, yeah. I mean, I think that's the emotion that I'm unpacking. And I think, like, if I think about just my love of language and words and things like that, I guess I think about word choice a lot. And what that means is that as I get older, I tend to speak a little bit slower. And because I'm thinking like in context, I'm trying to not only make my point, but also to do so clearly. And I think that I once had an advisor. Oh, okay. So here's some baggage. So I once had an advisor that I worked for, and he said, you know, it's okay to talk over your clients. You know, we need to kind of wow them every once in a while. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Like, no. It doesn't make any sense.
And I listen to people.
I was like, what do you mean? But I had to just bite my tongue at the moment. I was like, yeah, right. I think about that a lot. I think about what's the simplest possible way to make this really complex, esoteric thing maybe funny is part of it. Like, hey, let's laugh at this together at how absurd this thing is. And then second, just like, do you get it? Like, can I help you understand this thing? Like right away. And so I often, like when I'm writing a new piece, I'm like, do I have like a hook for this? Is there a reason someone should read this piece of work? So I'm oftentimes unpacking the material for them, but I'm also always thinking like, why does this matter for you? Like, why bother spending any time on the words that I've written? And I think that a lot of this just has to do with accessibility. Like, can I take this esoterica, really, really complex kernels of information and try to make them fun. And I think that's a big part of my process. And like, I was telling my wife this the other day, just for people who are listening to this, I do a lot of memes. Memes I think are hilarious, and they're also powerful pieces of culture delivered in little tiny packages. So I like memes. I was telling my wife the other day, she's like, why do you stay up so late, like on some of these blogs? And I was like, I oftentimes get stuck on the meme because anybody can explain the mechanics of these strategies. If you spend enough time in tax world, anyone can do this. I don't think there's anything particularly special about the work that I do. I'm just almost unilaterally focused on it. But I spend a lot of time packaging a meme because I want the material to be digestible quickly. And those memes will take me sometimes hours.
No, I think that's right. Can you actually deliver kind of the essential truth in a way that becomes visceral about something that is like painfully intellectual, right?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to me. Are you ready for the next question?
Yeah, of course.
What is your favorite drug?
Oh yeah, well, comedy, if comedy's a drug, then that's my secret weakness. I'm always looking for like, why is something funny? But if you want like a literal drug, it's by far caffeine. That's not a novel answer. I'm sorry I don't have something spicier for you. Oh, wait. Okay, so spicy. Is hot sauce a drug? If so, then like, I drink a lot of coffee.
What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, so I grew up playing the drums quite seriously. And so I'm very percussive. I enjoy rhythm. I want rhythm and precision. So those are things that I enjoy. I'm always listening. I'm always thinking about ways to modulate beats and things like that. It sounds so silly, but it is in my head all the time.
That's why you like Germanic sounding words.
Yes, it's exactly the same.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Okay, so this is going to sound like a crass response, but nowadays I'm very much, I like it when people take the time to package material for wide audiences. And so this is going to sound insane, but I actually listen to like a fair amount of pop music because I'm very, very interested in kind of pop as like a communication mechanism, not for the message in the song. Like usually that's not really that relevant. Sometimes it is, but I'm really interested in how the producers put the piece together to be as broadly accessible as possible. And so things that I don't like are very inward looking. They're the opposite of accessible. They're very much like, no, this is my content. I'm not going to do, I don't care about if anybody makes it, or I don't care if anybody understands it or gets it. As I'm very much like averse to that now. Like I'm into accessibility because I think it's hard. It's hard to make things that broadly accessible. It's very easy to look at your own self and just to produce content that is immediately satisfying. It's hard to reach into the minds of, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people and try to do something for that wide of an audience. So to very long answer to your question is I don't like insular work nowadays. And that might include some really esoteric music. That sounds like a snobby answer. It's weird, but I don't know. I don't know.
Well, you mentioned your wife just a little while ago. My wife reminds me that, when you share things, your thoughts and all that, you're really trying to, the concept at the core of that is a gift, right? So if you wrap your gift in a bunch of jargon and whatever, and it's like, it's up to the audience to get to the gift, like, what are you doing?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. I really enjoy hanging out with people. I really like talking with people. I really like hearing their stories, learning about their backgrounds. I really, really enjoy people. That is like what is interesting about life. And like, I think to make your content solely focused on your interests without a sense of packaging to make it accessible is just not, it sort of denies you the experience of other human beings and thinking about things the way that they think about it. And so I'm just turned off by work that's purely insular right now. But yeah, totally maybe in a couple of years it's
totally
different.
Get it. What is your favorite curse word?
Oh, it's definitely fuck. Yeah. If you want to put an exclamation point on a piece of work, at least for another couple of years, that one still has the exclamation point effect.
Who would you like to see on a new banknote?
Oh, man. I don't know. That's interesting. This is going to be crazy. I would like to see an artist on there. Okay, so here's the backing for that. I don't remember whoever said this, but it was like, you start with a brutalist society and then it's war seeking and then it turns into a capitalist society. And then after that, it's sort of a pleasure seeking society. People write poetry and things like that. Have we achieved that level of commonality in a survival sense to where we can focus on poetry and art. And would having an artist on the currency kind of represent that to a certain extent?
It'd be a good marker.
I don't know.
What profession other than your own would you never, ever want to attempt?
Doctor. Yeah. I would never be a doctor. My entire family's doctors. I'm sorry if any of them are listening. I love you all very much. I'm glad you're doing that work.
If you were reincarnated as a plant or an animal, what would it be?
I don't know, maybe a bird of some kind. Birds can do cool things. They can sing awesome songs. Their plumage is fascinating. They can fly. Maybe a predator bird so that I don't have to worry about anything except for humans. Maybe an eagle or something.
Are you ready for the last question?
Sure.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you get to the pearly gates?
I've thought about this, and in my mind, this is silly, maybe childish. I want some of these great mysteries resolved. I want to know definitively who shot JFK. If I have access to ultimate truth, I want all those questions resolved.
I love it. Well, Brent Sullivan, this was a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much. You are the Tax Alpha Insider, and I encourage people to check out your work and your blog, but you are so much more. So thanks so much for being here today.
This podcast is for entertainment and education only. Nothing here is financial advice. Treussard Capital Management is a registered investment advisor. Please visit our website, www.treussard.com, for additional information and disclaimers.